Hey GeoTrekkers, this is Dr. Hal, host of the GeoTrek podcast. Welcome to podcast episode number 71, which features a conversation with Tim Riecker, the Contrarian Emergency Manager. Tim's insights on how to mitigate losses from extreme weather and natural disasters will prove valuable for any professionals listening to this podcast who are involved in disaster mitigation. If you're new to the podcast, GeoTrek explores the world to learn about extreme weather and natural disasters, the impacts of such events, and what we can do to get out ahead of such disasters to reduce losses. We want you to make better sense of the world around you so you can take steps to make yourself, your family, and your community more resilient. Well, let's get into this conversation with Tim Riecker. Although he's based in upstate New York, his insights are very valuable to all of us everywhere. Hey GeoTrekkers, welcome to a new podcast. We're touching on emergency management today. This has been a favorite topic of our listeners. If you're just getting into the podcast and you want to hear as many podcasts as you can on that topic, check out podcast episode number 50 with Brandy Mai and 54 with John Stewart. Today we have a special guest, Tim Riecker, who's a partner with Emergency Preparedness Solutions and vice chair for the International Public Safety Association. Tim, thank you so much for coming on the GeoTrek podcast.
Excited to be here, Hal. I always like to talk about emergency management whenever I can. So,
Tim, drawing back on your many years of experience, how would you describe the state of emergency management in our current time? So, like, what are we doing well? What could be improved? I mean, what's your perspective on that?
So I think you plan on mentioning it later, that I have the moniker of the Contrarian Emergency Manager. So I do tend to be pretty critical of things in our profession. And I'm by no means perfect. But I think there's a lot of things in our profession that we kind of accept them as they are, and just kind of try to move on from things. And you know, there are some things in the profession that trouble me. You know, preparedness is really such a strong aspect of emergency management and planning. Creating emergency plans, disaster plans, whatever you want to call them, is really such a cornerstone of that. And we do it so incredibly poorly. It's just so often that I see really bad plans. I mean, plans that are not thoughtfully written, plans that are not collaboratively written, because we really need to have that perspective of a lot of different stakeholders to contribute to a plan, and plans that aren't written to enough detail. I so often find that plans are at way too high of a level, where they say, hey, we should do this thing, very, very big picture, but they don't explain how. They don't explain the details. They don't explain who's responsible for things. So that's a lot of what really concerns me in emergency management. That's one of the big things. That said, we have had, we continue to have a good evolution of things. I think that we are finding areas to improve upon, things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have a long way to go. I won't regard us as being successful yet, but we have finally, it seems, have had the full recognition of the need to do better, not only internally in the field in terms of and quite honestly, still a lot of folks in emergency management are white guys, but we need to diversify because we need to have a better understanding and representation of the communities that we're supporting. And that's something that we're not doing as well. Again, we have some motivation in that direction, but we do have a long way to go.
It sounds like you're saying we're moving in the right direction, but still have some distance to cover to kind of get where we need to be.
Quite a bit.
Yeah, that's interesting. Tim, could you explain too, from my understanding, there are these different levels, like you had mentioned in the beginning, telling people, you know what FEMA does, that's the kind of work I do, but this not only happens at the federal level, it also happens at the state level, at local levels. I mean, how do those emergency management partners kind of work together? And do we see the same type of collaborations today as we would have, say, 20, 30 years ago, or is it different?
It's different. It's stronger in a lot of ways. I obviously, after something like 9/11, one of the big failures of 9/11, there's a big focus on the intelligence failure, because there were different aspects of the intelligence community that had information, but none of them had the full picture. Had they shared that information with each other, they probably wouldn't have had the full picture, but they would have gotten the gist of it. It probably would have been 800 pieces out of a 1,000-piece puzzle.
But they might have connected some dots and said, hang on, something's in motion here.
Exactly. And so we had that. There were some other gaps in preparedness in terms of even beyond intel agencies, but even just simply response agencies and the emergency management agencies and all these needing to work together, needing to connect better, working with a lot of non-traditional types of agencies, human services agencies and organizations and that kind of thing.
Sure.
That has definitely improved through the years. Obviously, we, have been pushed by, every once in a while we get whacked in the head with something like a big hurricane,
Sure.
wildfires, a pandemic, which has obviously, demonstrated and reinforced this need. And we learn. The big thing is that we obviously need to embrace that learning and make positive change based on what we've learned. And again, a little bit of a frustration because just like so many organizations and disciplines, we have but we've always done it this way. Yeah. Well, okay. There's some good parts of that, but there's also some really bad stuff or less effective things that we need to be able to move beyond.
I know Brandy Mai talks a lot about that. We say, well, this is a way it's always been done, right? And
Yes.
That's in so many professions, you just do the way it's always been done, right? So we really need to have critical thinking and address a lot of these things and say, well, is that the most effective way to do it, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Tim, I want to ask you, now that we're talking about collaboration and all these different levels of government and organizations, do we see a lot of like nonprofits getting involved in the mix, say post-hurricane, right? So it's overwhelming how many needs there are on the ground. Is there a role for, say, like, a volunteer group or a church group or things like that to be kind of connected in with the recovery and response?
Tons. Quite honestly, there always has been, but through the years that has been amplified. Couple of reasons. One, I think that the need for certain things to be met, when we basically better recognition of some of the gaps that are out there, and the need to fix those, and recognizing that government can't fix everything. We don't have all the resources to do things. We have a bureaucracy that in some cases prevents us from doing things. So that's one thing that's kind of helped to amplify this. And the other one, another big thing, and not to knock them as an organization. I've always been a big fan of the Red Cross. And obviously I mentioned my roots of this ultimately go back to the Red Cross.
Sure.
But over the last 20 years or so, the Red Cross has really changed as an organization. In a lot of areas of the country, not everywhere, but a lot of areas of the country, we've seen their capability and capacity severely decrease, especially capacity. They have their paid staff is decreasing while their footprint of their chapters is increasing. I mean,
so they're stretched pretty thin.
Oh, they are. For example, there used to be numerous chapters in, say, the state of Vermont. Now, the state of Vermont and New Hampshire are all one giant Red Cross chapter.
Interesting. How do you explain the decrease in their staff and funding and things like that?
A lot of it does come down to funding. Less, probably less donations overall. I think probably in some cases, decreased interest in supporting them. And some of it is generational, some of it's economic, some of it's, there's a ton of different,
sure,
things that kind of come together with that. So with that gap that has been created in response, because the Red Cross for so long was just always so strongly relied on. I mean, they literally were written in plans that, sheltering, call the Red Cross.
So they were written in government emergency preparedness plans.
Oh yeah. And written in the wrong way. There are a lot of jurisdictions where truly their sheltering plan was to call the Red Cross.
Interesting. We'll just rely on them.
Yeah. The jurisdiction wouldn't even have their own actual plan. They just kind of erroneously gave up responsibility
I see.
Even though the Red Cross, was a great agency to do it. And in a lot of cases, they still are, but even they've recognized that they need a lot of partners. So they do rely on a lot of local community groups, church groups, that kind of thing. We've also seen some elevation of other nonprofits and volunteer groups that have filled in some gaps, not only those kind of left by this change in the Red Cross, but also gaps that we have recognized more broadly in disasters. So entities like World Central Kitchen, who will go out there and, their whole mission is to get food to victims and responders.
Sure,
And,
sure.
Once you have food, you can basically do anything.
Yeah, right.
And, they are used to working in clandestine areas all around the world. They showed up in Buffalo for the snowstorm.
Sure.
They have an ongoing operation in Ukraine. I mean, they're everywhere doing this stuff. They do an incredible job. There's some other, similar, there's like a barbecue relief organization, and they just show up with big barbecue pits, which is fantastic. So there's a lot of organizations that have come together to fill that gap.
You're right. In a disaster zone, once you have food and water, then it's like, okay, now we can get recovery going. Now we can get linemen up there bringing the electricity back. Right. You don't have food or water. You're really dead in the water,
Yeah, absolutely.
Tim, I wanted to ask you, I was looking at your biography. You have a lot of experience both with large event planning and response to natural disasters. So these on some level are very different things. One being like with a large, let's say there's a major concert that's going to happen in a college football stadium. We know the date, we know the time, we know 80,000 tickets were sold. Compared to a tornado outbreak, it's not telegraphed like that. There's a lot of uncertainty. So on some level, those two types of things seem very different, but I'm wondering if there's a lot of similarities too. I mean, how do you compare response to a natural disaster versus large event planning in response to what could go wrong there?
We learn from those things both ways. It's a two-way street. There are things when we do event planning that we learn from disasters, because in disasters, we obviously learn to deal with the unanticipated things. So you can have a large event, you're going to have 80,000 people, and inevitably things are going to go wrong. It can be very well planned, and you can make sure you have the right infrastructure to deal with things, but something can go wrong. You could have a foodborne illness type of thing. You could have a fire. You can have a stampede. You can have all sorts of things.
Sure.
And you need to have the plans in place to be able to deal with those. The great thing about planned events is that, as you said, Hal, there's a lot of notice. We can take the time to assess the threats and the hazards. We can look at the environment. We can look at the kind of the demographics of the folks who might be attending. And, we know that, like, hey, there's certain crowds that are going to flock to certain things. I've dealt with Woodstock. I was a public safety planner for Woodstock 99. Just before that, we had a concert from Phish that was here nearby in upstate New York. And you look at the demographics of the attendees, you look at the substances that they tend to bring with them and imbibe during these events. And, so you have to be realistic about this stuff and figure out, try to ascertain what it is that you're going to deal with, and how. Similarly, when you have, large disasters, whether it's from a natural hazard or otherwise, there are things that you can count on. So just like doing a planned event, there are certain assumptions that we can make. And most of the time we're pretty accurate with those assumptions, especially if we're fairly well practiced with it. We've dealt with tornadoes before. We've dealt with floods before.
Sure.
We know, most areas know, at least in generalities, what's needed and how they have to respond to them. But what we don't know is when it's going to happen, where it's going to happen, how it's going to happen, what the magnitude and intensity is. Those are all things that we now have to kind of knee-jerk react to.
Yeah,
but
right.
if we have good plans in place, we can do better with it.
It sounds like you're saying with the events, I mean, we know the date, time, and location, but it sounds like you're trying to kind of paint a picture ahead of time. Who's going to be there? What kind of people? How many people? Where are they going to park? Where are they going to go to restrooms, right? You're trying to get kind of a landscape before it happens.
Mm-hmm.
But the advantage is, again, we know the date and time. It's not like just 80,000 people usually show up,
Yeah.
overnight. Really interesting comparison there between those two. And I could see how knowledge of one kind of helps response to another.
Absolutely.
Tim, looking at your fabulous blog at timothyriecker.com, man, there's a lot of content there. I was really impressed by the scope of work you've done on that blog for years and the depth that you really bring to these different insights. You obviously have the moniker there, the Contrarian Emergency Manager. We touched on that a little bit before, but I mean, where did you get that name? How long have you had that name? Really, where does that come from?
So I wish it was a cool story that like someone dubbed me the Contrarian Emergency Manager.
Like at Woodstock, they said, hey, come up here. You're going to be the Contrarian Emergency Manager. We deem you.
Yeah. No. So, sadly, it wasn't anything like that. Through the years, I kind of looked at the tone of a lot of the blog posts that I had put out there. And a lot of it had been around pushing back on accepted practices, pushing back on bad planning, pushing back on bad reports that, FEMA releases every year, pushing back on standards that aren't applied well or erroneous standards that we just kind of like as a profession just kind of seem to shrug and accept.
Okay.
So between that and between being a fan of someone who is kind of a consultant to consultants.
Sure.
And he oftentimes uses the term contrarian to kind of explain his approach to things when it comes to consulting. And now having been, as I've mentioned, a consultant for 12 years, really always kind of looking at better ways to do things and to improve. And there's self-help books for everything. There's self-help books for emergency managers. There's self-help books for consultants. I'm sure there's self-help books for weather folks as well. To some extent. And so contrarianism and not in a means of being a roadblock to things, not in terms of being an impediment to progress, but in terms of, calling out practices that have been going on for a long time that are not great, but people just seem to kind of go with. And I don't understand that.
So pushing back on that status quo and kind of questioning, like, wait, why are we doing it this way?
Yeah, exactly. And I don't necessarily have all the answers. A lot of my blogs will ask a lot of questions. They will point things out and I'll say, hey, I don't necessarily know a better way to do this, or I'm not recommending a better way to do it. But I think the way that it's being done is poor and there's a lot of room for improvement.
My favorite teachers and educators, it's not like they just stand up there giving you a monologue, right? They ask questions, they facilitate discussion. That's really what you're doing by asking these questions, sharing your insights. You're really facilitating an online discussion in the profession.
That's what I try to do. And I've been told my name is whispered in the halls of FEMA, and various organizations and that kind of thing, for the better or the worse of it. And I'll get phone calls from certain people that, don't want to put anything in writing because it might get them in trouble with their employer. But I've gotten some phone calls from some pretty prominent individuals in the business, who have said, hey, yeah, we definitely agree with you and we want to make change. And, how can we do that? What can we do better? Or, hey, just to let you know, there's a lot of people here who support the things that you're writing about. But we're stuck in this bureaucracy. We're stuck in this legacy of the way we've always done things. So, but yeah, it at least it gets the conversations going, and some of them have been great. Some other things I think, I'm sure some people see my stuff and read it and kind of roll their eyes and say, oh, this guy's just complaining about something else. But I also try not to make it negative. I try to put a positive spin on it. I mean, there's obviously a seriousness to this. And in a way that a colleague put this to me a few years ago that stuck with me is that, first responders save lives, emergency managers save communities. And that's serious work. Both of them are obviously really serious work. And we need to buckle down and do better in a lot of these areas. And that's not to say that, as a profession, we're doing poorly, because we're not. There's some incredible people doing amazing work out there for communities, and just, mind-blowing stuff. And we really need to grab onto that, that momentum and those best practices, and keep things moving forward.
Sure. Tim, I have to say, in relation to your engagement in your profession, one of your colleagues, I won't tell you who, when I was preparing for this podcast, he or she called you an emergency management ninja in the best possible way. Just said, this guy is like in on everything and just doing amazing work. But you've been called a ninja in a very good way. So you're just, I think you're engaging and getting people thinking and dialoguing. And that's, I think, a huge value to the profession. So keep up that good work. I'm going to be reading more of your blog posts for sure.
Is that Brandy that called me a ninja?
It may have been. It just may have been. Everyone, again, you can check out this blog post. It's at Timothy Riecker. That's Timothy RIECKER.com. There are a lot of thought-provoking blog posts. I was able to share that with my colleagues as I prepared for this podcast. And actually, one of my friends with the National Weather Service, he has a background doing a lot with response to different disasters. He's worked in different federal agencies. And so he had some questions. Here's a question that he had for you. Really, how has the quality of emergency management changed or improved with the advent of the Emergency Management Accreditation Program? That's something we saw that you talked about in your blogs there. How has that affected the state of emergency management?
Standards are a fantastic thing. And I think anytime that we can establish a floor for everyone to at least rise to, and to be the foundation of what we do, I think that's great. The Emergency Management Accreditation Program, EMAP, is fantastic with that, and it's been around for a while. So somewhere around 2000 or so, or actually before that, I think, is when they started to kind of put some things together. I was part of New York State's EMAP compliance team, panicking throughout the agency to make sure that we had every process and procedure documented. And this isn't just in response. This is every aspect of emergency management, everything we do before, during, and after disaster. And the big thing about standards and accreditations and compliance is to make sure that you have everything documented. So many agencies and organizations do the things, but they don't have things documented. And documentation obviously helps to make sure that we're doing things consistently and that we're not missing anything and all that. So a lot of that stuff helps. And EMAP, so much of EMAP is based on what was until recently NFPA 1600, which is the standard on emergency management and crisis management and continuity. And 1600 has very recently been folded into a new standard, NFPA 1616, which has been combined with some other related emergency management standards. And kind of one of my career benchmarks was actually being on the team to do that. I was as a subject matter expert with the NFPA to pull together the 1600 component of 1616, and in the process doing some revisions and streamlining and all that kind of stuff. And that was that was awesome. It's these things are not exciting reads. You'll probably fall asleep. You'll have like super long blinks, kind of thing, and nodding off. But really important to a lot of the things that we do, and good standards like that, whether it's 1616, EMAP, whatever. Again, a lot of common roots that they have. They tell you what needs to be done, but not how.
Okay, I got you.
Which I think is great, because that leaves room for progress. They'll say, hey, you need to track whatever information this is. Okay, that's great. They don't tell you how to do it. Sure. Some people might be doing it on a spreadsheet. Some people might have developed a database. Someone might be using an off-the-shelf third-party thing that was developed. Someone might be coming up with something completely different for it. And that's what helps these standards be scalable to meet needs, because not every emergency management office has dozens of people. Most of them have one. And that one person, especially at the local level, usually has numerous other hats that they're wearing. So, the people can do and what works for them.
Yeah, and when you provide the guideline of what needs to be done, but don't spell out every detail of how it needs to be done, that leaves room for innovation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So EMAP, I mean, really to answer the question, EMAP has really elevated that foundational standard for emergency management. And not everyone is accredited. It is something that does take a lot of work to get into, to make happen. But it really does help in a lot of ways. I've seen a lot of professionalism, professionalization, I think is the right word, of a lot of practices in emergency management because of people striving to adhere to that standard.
Well, and Tim, this seems to address what you talked about early on. One of the dangers of just being too broad and too general, right? If you have specific standards and detail into this, all of a sudden you're not just saying, "Well, we told everyone to respond to it." Like you're providing some detail and some standards to it, right?
Right.
So I think that's super important. Tim, something that stood out to me when I was thinking about this podcast, it's with emergency management, you're doing your best, like you said, to save communities. So you're trying to prevent loss of life. You're trying to prevent loss of property. It's really difficult sometimes to measure and quantify something we've prevented. Right. You mentioned 9/11. I mean, imagine if 9/11 was prevented, would we really appreciate the scope of what we were saved from? So the question I had for you, when emergency management professionals have the foresight, the resources, the manpower to get out in front of a potential disaster and prevent it from happening, how is this quantified on the back end? Is the scope of lives saved and losses prevented ever fully grasped by society? And does this lead to more funding and resources being allocated for more great work, right? Do we say, hey, this is amazing. They saved hundreds of lives. They saved maybe billions in dollars lost. This is amazing. Let's keep funding this great work. Or is it kind of sometimes lost in the mix?
Hal, that's the hardest question anyone has ever asked me.
I know, and I kind of went on there. I asked you a couple different points of it, but
it's such a hard question.
Maybe start with how do we quantify what has been prevented?
Yeah, and that's exactly, I think, the root of the challenge is trying to figure out what that return on investment is, if you will, to basically bring it to like a fundamental business term. And so often it's where we really try to measure that return on investment is in hazard mitigation. So the things that we do to either lessen the impact of a disaster, or all out prevent that disaster from happening. So like, stronger building construction to make buildings earthquake, or, stronger against earthquakes. There's a bunch of things we can do for flood protection to, better culverts and retention ponds and that kind of stuff, or even elevating homes and other structures. There are some of those things that we do that do become super apparent. And it's typically the things that when the disaster still occurs and we can take a look at it. And so like, say we have that hurricane come in on the Jersey Shore, and we've just did this, decades long program of elevating homes and other structures on the shore. So you see that storm surge come in, you see feet of water.
Sure.
And hey, there's some of the structures people simply refuse to elevate. Their structures are destroyed or at the very best completely swamped.
Sure.
Where the elevated ones are, minimal damage or, largely untouched. So you can see that evidence right there. And I think when something is visual, when we can, take pictures of it right then and there, we can bring our elected officials out to see the stuff. When we can get it out to the media, it tells a story and people can actually compare, apples to apples with it.
Yeah.
When we have prevented a disaster, that's the challenge. That's when all of us will celebrate in the back room on the assumption that we're pretty sure that the work that we did resulted in preventing that disaster from occurring or severely reduce the magnitude of it. But it may be very hard to overtly prove.
Sure.
And like you said, like with your 9/11 example, if planes didn't hit buildings, wow, that's a huge success. That's a massive success. We saved literally thousands of lives, billions of dollars. What an absolutely amazing thing if we prevented that. Who who would have known? Would there still have been so much money afterwards to go into terrorism prevention and counterterrorism programs and all the other stuff that we had? Probably not, because people would have said, oh, clearly not that big of a deal. We stopped it. We're doing fine.
It wasn't a story. Let's move on, right?
Yeah. So it's a big catch-22. And obviously we don't want disasters to happen. Sure. But when they do, and it's inevitable that they do, we do want to capture that as best as we possibly can, capture the imagery, capture the data, tell a story, and use that to build awareness.
Sure.
Use that to support good decision making, use that to support increased grant funding, and good, out of the box thinking that's going to be progressive, that's going to help us do better the next time around. So we really have to capitalize on it. And it almost seems like it's negative, like ambulance chaser kind of
sure.
attitude to have, but the disasters are going to happen, and we have to capitalize on the fact on when they do happen, so we can figure out how to do things better. Yeah.
Well, we want to fund good work that is making a difference, right? And yes. So sometimes the difference you're making is lives were saved, property damage was reduced. And so I think to quantify that does make sense, right? You can justify the work that you've been doing.
So much of it, Hal, and you're a weather and disaster scientist. Climate change is such a huge struggle with people, because we can't physically show them. We can't compare. Well, if we weren't in this thing called climate change, is that really what's making weather different?
Sure.
Or worse in some areas? Some people are going to, we can attribute a lot of things in climate change to the snowstorm out in Buffalo. Now, of course, the misnomer, because we sold climate change really, really poorly a couple decades ago by calling it global warming. And that kind of screwed us over, because now you have people who will roll their eyes and say, oh yeah, well, there's your global warming and climate change. We just got, 7 feet of snow in the city of Buffalo. But
they're not connecting it. Yeah.
There actually are things that do contribute and connect to that from climate change. But it's such an intangible thing to get people to really connect.
Tim, so you gave the example of a hurricane coming into the Jersey Shore. Unfortunately, if that happened, it would be a devastating thing. The National Hurricane Center would have a report showing the meteorological conditions. What were the storm track? What were the winds? What was the flood level? And then they would also share in their report the impacts, losses of lives, economic losses. So do you know of anyone professionally that would go into a place like that and actually write up in a report, like how many houses were elevated, how many houses were saved? Is that documented anywhere professionally, that someone would say, yes, there was $3 billion in losses, but there would have been $6 billion if it wasn't for this program in the state of New Jersey or something like that?
Consistently, no. And that's also one of the problems that we have, is that there really isn't a lot of that. I will say that, and a big shout out to the academic side of emergency management, because there are a lot of academic programs, especially, higher level research programs, that kind of stuff, that will secure grant funding to go out and do that kind of disaster research.
Okay.
Literally in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. So, while, within days of a disaster occurring, they're sending researchers and grad students and all that kind of stuff out there to do a lot of this data collection. There is some of it that FEMA will capture as part of their processes within the public assistance and individual assistance grant programs, and doing their disaster assessments and that kind of stuff. But in a lot of cases, it's not quantified in the way that it needs to be. I mean, FEMA's assessments, unless they do have something that is specifically geared toward measuring mitigation impacts, they're typically just out there to figure out what is damaged and to what extent. They're not looking at what survived. they're looking to see what's damaged. So they're kind of turning a blind eye to that structure that's still standing because that one over there is demolished.
And maybe there's a justification for doing both, really, right?
Yes, yeah, there absolutely should be, and there has been for the last few years some movement to build the National Disaster, I believe it's the National Disaster Safety Board.
Okay.
So something very similar to like the NTSB, where they look at transportation incidents, like
Sure.
the big train derailment out in Ohio. Where there would be this development of this disaster office that would operate independently, so they wouldn't be part of FEMA, and they would go out there and they would do studies on disasters and on the different impacts of disasters and write after action reports and provide a lot of other data that can help us to improve.
Yeah, that makes a lot of
to
sense.
identify, what worked and what didn't work. So there has been some push behind that. It's just, slow bureaucratic legal stuff with our elected officials.
Tim, you mentioned academics. There's a growing number of colleges and universities offering coursework and degree programs in emergency management now. A lot of it tends to be by nature theoretical, right? It's book learning. It's a lot of reading.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a dichotomy between that and actually getting boots on the ground and experiencing a disaster? I mean, for our students listening, for our young professionals, is there a gap between those two? Like, do these programs, do they really help a student learn how to respond to this? Or is there kind of a difference between the academic side and the actual response side?
So theory is important. It's important for us to know, the how and why of things. And I'm sure, as a weather scientist, you can appreciate that. And research is obviously important to help substantiate and uncover new things and to really help figure out a lot of stuff, current practices and what some potential other practices can be. But that said, a lot of emergency management academic programs that we see out there are theory based. So I actually, and I'm not sure if you knew this, I actually started an emergency management certificate program at a community college here. It's fully online, so anyone in the world can take it. And our big push when we developed it was we need to flip that script a little bit. Again, theory is still important because we need to build a foundation, but we're going to do a lot about practice. We're really going to tell people not just why they're doing something, but how to actually do it.
Tim, I did not realize that you helped develop that certificate program. What's the name of the community college? How can people find this?
It's Herkimer County Community College. It's part of the State University of New York system. So it's a fully online certificate program that we built from the ground up. We do have a couple of non-emergency management courses in there, like sociology.
Sure.
I'm a big believer that what we do in emergency management is actually rooted in sociology. Excuse me. So obviously there is a little bit more theory in there. And then we also have a requirement for earth sciences. So people can either take a meteorological course or they can take a physical earth science course, like geology or something like that, just to give, little perspective on what some of these hazards are and where things come from. But the rest of the program, we cover things before, during, and after. We have a risk communications course. We have a business continuity course that's in there, and they're all online.
Yeah, I love that you put it online. I know a lot of our listeners are going to want to check that out, and it's pretty cool that it's accessible to everybody.
Yeah. Please do check it out. It's rolling enrollment, so we have it's basically built if you are dedicated to do it in a full-time capacity.
Sure.
It's built to be done in 2 terms. So one year.
No, that's awesome. No, fantastic. I love that perspective. And like you said, it's accessible to anybody that wants to do that. Tim, I want to land the plane here with one last question for you. It's the magic wand question. If you had a magic wand to change one thing in your profession, what would it be?
Better plans.
Nice.
People need to write better plans. And And here's the caveat on the magic wand. I don't want the better plans to just magically appear. I want the magic wand to motivate people to build plans the right way, because there's also a huge benefit to that collaborative engagement of building a plan.
I was just going to use the word collaborative. You brought that up several times in this podcast, people working together, bringing all the stakeholders to the table. It sounds like it's more than just putting a 30-page piece of paper on a desk and say the plan's done. A lot of it's the process of how you got there, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's when people put in the work, they get a better product out of it. And it's, sometimes a challenge being a consultant, because, I get hired to write disaster plans. Well, sure, I can, put some stuff together and I can mail you a 3-inch binder that's going to have your plan in it. But you know what? It's not your plan. It's my plan that I wrote for you. So
that's right. You weren't involved in that process. Yeah.
Right. So without their engagement, without their local knowledge, without them establishing what the priorities are, I have a lot of experience doing these things. I can leverage a lot of that experience. I can facilitate that process, but the ownership of it has to be theirs. They have to put in the work. I can type. I tell folks 85% of my job is typing. But they need to give me the content.
Yeah. And I'm not an emergency manager, but from my friends in the field, it seems like the term relationships comes up a lot too. That again, when the response hits, you want to fall back on those relationships that were developed at the workshops and when it was sunny and 75 degrees, right? Because now there's a flood, and now is not the time to try to foster new relationships, right? Those should already be there.
Exactly. I want to have already known you, Hal. So if we're both going to show up on a disaster scene together, I don't want to be meeting you for the first time and trying to figure out who you are, who you work for, what your agency's priorities are, what you bring to the table, what your capabilities are, that kind of stuff. If I know that stuff ahead of time, if both of us know that stuff ahead of time, then we're already several steps ahead.
That's right. We have the relationship. We have the trust, right? When you give perspective on something, I know this guy, we've been in workshops together for a decade. I can trust what he says, right?
Yep.
Tim, thank you so much. Your insights are I find them refreshing and, really hopeful. You're providing a lot of resources out there. You're doing great work. You're helping educate our listeners here today. So how can our listeners find you if they want to connect with you? Are there professional workshops you go to every year? How can people find you online? How can they connect with you?
So a couple things I'll plug. LinkedIn is probably, professionally one of the easiest ways to find me. I'm actually on LinkedIn as the Contrarian Emergency Manager, or you can go in there and search my name, but Contrarian Emergency Manager, I think people can more easily remember. My business, Emergency Preparedness Solutions, the website's epsllc.biz. That also has my blog in it as well, so people can find that from there. I'm also, as you mentioned in the introduction, vice chair for the International Public Safety Association, IPSA.
Tim, thank you so much for sharing these profound insights with us. The biggest take-home message for me in this podcast is that communities can best reduce their losses from extreme weather and natural disasters through better plans, but more important than the plans themselves is the path that communities take to get these plans. Tim shared about the benefits for communities who are actively involved in their own hazard mitigation planning and take a collaborative approach involving all stakeholders in the dialogue of developing these plans. This approach helps communities to have more ownership of these plans, as opposed to hiring a consultant or a group of people to do all this work for them. This approach also ensures long-term benefits as well. I've noticed in my professional life that organizations and communities that foster change through relationships and growing a network of leaders are more secure long-term than those that rely on the efforts of one or two people. The future is uncertain. Sometimes leaders may resign, change jobs, move away, or even pass away. And I've noticed that organizations and communities that depend on one person for leadership often take a huge hit when we remove that leader, as opposed to organizations and communities that have developed an extensive base of leaders who can continue the work once the leader is gone. So really interesting insights there. Tim, really appreciate you taking time to share with us. I think these are very thought-provoking topics that we discussed on the podcast. And again, it will relate to people in all areas of hazard mitigation. Thank you again to our listeners as well. Your support and interest in this podcast, sharing it with others. This is what has made us the #1 podcast for natural disasters. Really appreciate your involvement. We try to bring you fresh content with each new podcast. Wanted to thank as well the GeoTrek marketing team based in Mobile, Alabama. They do an amazing job of editing these podcasts and videos, adding a lot of different editing to the sounds and the audio, and disseminating these podcasts to reach a really broad audience. So special thanks to our team there as well. Well, everyone, thanks so much for tuning in to this episode. We'll catch you on the next episode of the GeoTrek podcast.